It was the kind of small-town repair shop where the scent of oil and honesty lingered in the air. Tucker Brant had worked there for 18 years, keeping engines alive and hearts a little warmer. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. His hands told stories, stories of reliability, of grit, of loyalty. Last Thursday, the story changed. Mrs. Darlene, 82, shuffled into the shop. Her electric scooter was dead, and so was her budget. She barely scraped by on a fixed income. Her groceries depended on that scooter. Tucker didn't think twice. He fixed it quietly, stayed late, and paid for the part himself. But the next morning, his boss, slick-haired and soft-palmed, was waiting. "Company policy," he said. "No freebies, you're done. Fired, no severance, no thanks, just silence." Tucker didn't argue. He never did. That night, Darlene baked him a peach cobbler and left it at his doorstep with a note. "Some people have engines, you have a heart." But by morning, everything would change. Because across the cracked asphalt of the empty lot, engines began to growl. 3 matte black luxury cars, spotless in the rising sun. Out stepped a man built like consequence and calm thunder. Jason Statham. He didn't come to chat. He came with purpose. "You Tucker Brant?" His voice carried weight. Tucker nodded. "You fixed something no one else saw as worth fixing. I respect that." And that's how the quiet man who fixed scooters found himself at the center of a story bigger than any shop floor. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and how you'd handle it if standing up for someone cost you everything. Because this isn't just about a scooter, it's about character, and how sometimes that's what drives the real engine. Tucker Brant wasn't born into much. Raised on the edge of Dayton, Ohio, in a weather-worn duplex with a backyard full of rusted dreams, he learned early how to keep things running that others had given up on. His father had worked at the same shop before him, Brant and Sons Auto, but the and Sons part faded after the place was sold to a franchise chain. Still, Tucker stayed on, fixing more than just cars. He became the kind of man you called when the world went sideways. He liked quiet, liked working with his hands. He wasn't interested in screens or small talk, just good work. His co-workers respected him, but they didn't understand him. In a shop full of noise, Tucker was stillness. The community, though, knew his worth. Single moms, old vets, and folks who fell through the cracks, they all found their way to Tucker. He'd patch up their beaters, refuse tips, and just nod when they tried to thank him. Darlene Hargrove had been one of those folks for years. Widowed. Young, she lived 2 streets over and walked her toy poodle past the shop every morning. Her scooter was more than just transportation. It was freedom. When it broke down, she rolled it in by hand, embarrassment in her eyes. Tucker saw her struggling. He didn't wait for paperwork, didn't ask for a dime. He just fixed it, left the invoice blank, and handed her the keys. He thought that was the end of it. But his new manager, Evan Clark, had a different idea. A man obsessed with profit margins and quarterly goals, Evan saw generosity as a threat. And when he found out Tucker had comped the job without approval, he made an example of him. That decision would come back to haunt him. Tucker didn't make a scene. That wasn't his style. When Evan fired him, Tucker wiped the grease from his hands, handed over his worn-out shop apron, and walked out without a word. The other mechanics stared, stunned. Some wanted to say something, but the silence Tucker left behind was heavier than any protest. He walked home, the sun starting to dip behind the grain elevators, casting long shadows across the narrow roads. At the corner, he passed Darlene's place. Her porch light was on, soft and warm. He kept walking. Later that evening, she knocked on his door. Her poodle, Buttons, waited patiently at her feet. She held out a foil-covered pan and a handwritten note. Tucker opened it. The cobbler still warm, the handwriting shaky but sincere. "People like you are rare," it read. "And that matters." He sat on his porch, eating alone, his mind turning gears he couldn't fix. Rent was due in 2 weeks. His savings were modest, and he knew people like Evan didn't just fire you. They blacklisted you. Word travels fast in small towns. The next morning, Tucker woke to the sound of thunder. Not from the sky, but engines. Deep, guttural, commanding. Outside, 3 blacked-out vehicles pulled into the gravel lot across the street. Out of the lead car stepped Jason Statham. Not an actor, not this time. This was the man himself. Jason didn't waste words. "You're the guy who fixed the scooter?" Tucker nodded once. "I need a mechanic. Someone with hands that understand. More than engines. Someone who gives a damn." Tucker's brow furrowed. "Why me?" "Because in a world full of men who measure worth by dollars," Jason said, "you measured it by dignity." And that was the moment the story shifted gears. Tucker wasn't quick to trust. Years in the trenches of forgotten labor had taught him that big promises usually came with bigger strings. But something about Jason was different. He spoke plainly, and his eyes carried the same weight Tucker saw in his father's the day he buried his mother, grief wrapped in quiet resolve. Still, the offer felt like a dream. Jason explained it straight. He was opening a private automotive retreat for veterans and first responders, a place where they could rebuild not just cars, but their lives. He needed someone real, someone who understood both the metal and the meaning. Tucker hesitated. "I'm not some miracle worker," he muttered. "You're more than that," Jason replied. "You're honest." But as word got out, Evan heard the news, and he wasn't pleased. His grip on the town's auto market was fragile. Jason's arrival threatened that. He began spreading rumors, calling Tucker disloyal, even implying he'd stolen from the shop. He leaned on old favors with suppliers to freeze Tucker out. Tucker, now working from a makeshift garage Jason rented on the edge of town, kept his head down. But the hits kept coming. An inspection was suddenly scheduled. His landlord received pressure to revoke the lease. Clients started getting nervous. Jason stood by him, calm as ever. "Let it come," he said. "Pressure reveals the truth." Tucker tried to shake it off, but inside the old doubt stirred. He'd stuck his neck out once and lost everything. Was it happening again? And then Darlene arrived at his shop, not on a scooter, but walking. She brought others, former customers, folks who remembered what Tucker had done for them. One by one, they stood in silent solidarity. Evan might have owned a business, but Tucker had earned something better. Late that night, Tucker sat alone in the workshop, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. The world outside had turned quiet again, but inside him, something churned. He wasn't just fighting to fix cars anymore. He was fighting to hold on to the part of himself that refused to harden. The betrayal from Evan cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Tucker had given that shop his best years. Loyalty, sweat, silence. And it had cost him more than just a paycheck. It had taken a piece of his trust in people. Now, here was Jason, a man who barely knew him, placing belief where others had placed doubt. Tucker felt the weight of that. Darlene's visit that day had stirred something too. Seeing her walk, cane in hand, flanked by neighbors who'd once sat in his waiting room. He hadn't expected that. They didn't come with signs or speeches, they just stood wordless and proud. That's when Tucker realized something. He hadn't just fixed cars. He'd given people a reason to feel seen. Jason entered the shop quietly, setting a coffee down beside him. "You good?" he asked. Tucker nodded, though the lump in his throat said otherwise. Jason leaned against the workbench. "You think this is about auto work? It's not. It's about the kind of world we want to build, one where kindness isn't punished." They sat in silence, the way men do when the words matter too much to be said all at once. Tucker looked around the shop. Tools in place, new lifts coming in, a future beginning to form. He took a deep breath. "Then let's build that world." Jason gave a slow nod, and for the first time in weeks, Tucker allowed himself a small smile. Over the next week, things began to shift. With Jason's backing, Tucker's garage, now officially named Brant Restoration and Performance, started to gain traction. Not just because of the name behind it, but because of what it stood for. Second chances, respect, and skilled work done with integrity. Veterans began arriving from nearby counties, some with PTSD, others just looking for a place to belong. Jason had quietly been reaching out for months, and now his vision was taking shape. Tucker became the unspoken heart of it all. He trained them not just in mechanics, but in patience, rhythm, trust. He taught them how to listen to what a machine was really saying, the way a good man listens when words fall short. Even local media caught wind of the story. A reporter stopped by for a feature piece. Tucker, of course, said little. Jason did the talking, praising the crew and the mission. The article went viral in the region. Donations started coming in. Parts were offered. A food truck offered to park outside daily. Momentum at last. Evan, watching from a distance, began to feel his grip loosening. A few loyal customers asked why Tucker had really been let go. His answers were thin. And more troubling, his own staff had begun to question his leadership. Tucker didn't celebrate. He just worked. That was his way. But Jason watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. One afternoon, as they closed up shop, Jason clapped a hand on Tucker's shoulder. "You ever think maybe all that hardship led you here for a reason?" Tucker didn't answer, but he looked out across the yard where a vet taught a teenager how to rebuild a carburetor, and something in his eyes softened. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. But peace, like trust, is fragile. Evan wasn't done. His ego, bruised by the success of Tucker's new venture, began to twist into something darker. He called in a favor with a city inspector, digging up a decade-old zoning issue related to the property Tucker now worked on. A permit discrepancy, buried in red tape, gave them grounds to serve a cease and desist. The notice hit Tucker like a wrench to the chest. He found it taped to the front door one morning, legalese stamped in red, threatening fines and closure. His hands trembled, not from fear but from frustration. He'd played it straight, done it right. And still, the system bent for the powerful. Jason was furious. "He's making this personal," he said, pacing the shop. "He wants you to fold." But Tucker just stared at the paper. "I can't fight him with lawyers. I don't have that kind of money." Jason nodded slowly. "Then maybe we fight another way." That day, Jason made some calls, not to attorneys, but to people. Reporters, advocates, a retired Marine-turned-city councilman. They rallied around the garage like an old-school posse, not with weapons, but with truth. They organized a community rally on the property, a legal form of protest, complete with veterans giving testimonials, customers sharing their stories, and even Darlene stepping up to the mic. The mayor, caught off guard by the public attention, had no choice but to respond. An emergency review was ordered. The zoning issue, quickly deemed outdated, was resolved by the week's end. Evan, humiliated, lashed out one last time, publishing a smear piece online accusing Tucker of emotional manipulation and attention-seeking. But this time, the town didn't buy it. The comments flooded in. "He fixed my mom's car for free. He helped my son get his first job." And Evan learned something: character can't be discredited. The storm passed, but its echo lingered. Tucker stood on the shop floor, staring at the old Brant name stenciled on the wall. He thought of his father, of long days under hoods and longer nights wondering if hard work ever really paid off. Now people were showing up in droves, not for service, but for something deeper: hope, belonging, purpose. What Jason had started was growing into something neither of them fully expected, but one final test waited. A local dealership, Evan's biggest backer, announced plans to open a community outreach shop just down the road. Slick branding, empty words, and worse, they poached one of Tucker's newer trainees with a fat paycheck and empty promises. The loss hit hard. Tucker didn't blame the kid. He knew desperation well. But it was a reminder: people will always try to copy what they don't understand. Jason watched the news and simply shook his head. "They think if they dress it in the right words, it becomes the same thing." Tucker replied quietly, "It doesn't come from the words." So they doubled down. Not with flash, but with honesty. Tucker opened weekend workshops for teens. Veterans offered counseling services in the back room. A single mom was hired as lead scheduler. They didn't just repair cars anymore, they repaired dignity. Then came the phone call from a national organization for transitional veterans. They wanted to feature Brant restoration in their new docuseries on American renewal. Tucker almost said no. Fame made him uncomfortable. But Jason looked him in the eye. This isn't about you, Tucker. It's about every person who ever thought. Kindness made them weak. He paused, then smiled. Let the country see what real strength looks like. And with that, the final mile of the road lay ahead. The day of the shoot arrived quietly, just as Tucker preferred. The film crew was small, respectful. They didn't ask him to pose or dramatize or exaggerate. They just followed him, quietly, capturing a man doing honest work in a shop that had become more than a business. It was a sanctuary. Tucker walked them through his routine, his voice measured and low. He introduced the veterans, never calling attention to their scars or stories, just their skills, their progress. He showed them the wall where customer thank you notes were pinned, next to Darlene's original cobbler recipe. Jason stood in the background, nodding occasionally, never stealing focus. He knew this was Tucker's story. He'd merely opened the door. When the segment aired 2 weeks later, it struck a nerve across the country. Viewers called in from Michigan to New Mexico. Donations tripled overnight. 3 more veterans' garages were announced, modeled after Tucker's. But none would carry his name. He didn't want it. Instead, he took that attention and did the only thing he knew how. He kept working, kept listening, kept fixing. Evan's franchise began to dwindle. His attempt at outreach failed when customers realized there was no soul behind the slogan. He quietly sold off his business and left town. No one missed him. And one morning, as spring broke over the fields, a silver scooter pulled into the lot. Darlene, beaming, handed Tucker a small envelope. Inside was a check, not from her, but from a group of neighbors who had pooled money to buy the land outright. No more leases, no more threats. You gave us something no one else did, she said. A place where people mattered more than machines. Tucker nodded, eyes glassy. Sometimes justice doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it's found in the quiet click of a closing wrench and the peace that follows. There's a saying in towns like these. The measure of a man isn't what he builds, but what he rebuilds when everything's been taken. Tucker Brant rebuilt more than a garage. He rebuilt belief. He never sought the spotlight. Fame made him fidget. What mattered were the small moments, teaching a vet to steady his hands again, seeing a young man leave the shop with oil on his shirt and pride in his eyes, hearing Darlene's laughter float across the lot as her scooter zipped by. Jason Statham eventually returned to Los Angeles, his mission complete, but not forgotten. He left Tucker with a single message carved into a plaque that now hangs above the shop entrance. You fixed more than machines. You reminded us what being a man really means, and that legacy continues, long after the headlines fade, because the heart of the story wasn't Jason's arrival or Evan's downfall. It was the quiet decision of a man to do the right thing when no one was watching, to offer help without expecting a return, to measure wealth not in numbers, but in impact. In a time where kindness is too often mistaken for weakness, Tucker proved that real strength is silent, steady, and stubbornly good. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Every day we're handed choices, some small, some life-altering. We can choose to protect ourselves or protect what's right. One leads to safety, the other leads to legacy. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever stood up for something, even when it cost you. Because stories like Tucker's don't belong to one man, they belong to all of us. And maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps this world from falling apart, not engines, but the men who know how to mend them.